I don't think I have anything specific to
Hey guys,
to your question because I get the
not sure if anyone's going to watch. You know, I'm going to have one viewer. I have figured out a topic. I'm going to send the link for the stream to someone who wanted to engage with it. It'll help me distill my thoughts a little bit better to have some questions about it. But in this stream, I want to pose a hypothetical and then kind of see what this guy who's going to engage with the stream thinks about my thoughts about artificial intelligence and what I call the Futurist delusion. Let me turn down my TV because that may be a problem. Anyway, yeah, what I call the Futurist delusion in terms of expecting more of artificial intelligence than probably will even result. Let me send this link really quick, and then I'll get into the content. Well, okay, so in this one, I wanted to talk about some of the expectations for where artificial intelligence is going to go in the future, and why I don't believe that we're ever going to reach any kind of post-singularity dystopia. Why I think it's ultimately irrational to expect that there will be a dystopian outcome from advancements in artificial intelligence. I guess I don't, the common expectation, what I call the futurist's delusion about artificial intelligence, is that we're going to reach some point where these things exceed us in intelligence and capacity, and they're going to destroy us or something. And, you know, this, I don't know if I call it a delusion, more so for a concise title, because I don't necessarily think it's a delusion. I think that it's simply a very pessimistic expectation for where artificial intelligence is going to go ultimately. So that's kind of the topic that I wanted to talk about. Having these aggrandized expectations for where artificial intelligence is going to go, whether that's going to mimic human consciousness. I mean, I was talking with a friend in the past, and I realized that we had a conversation on the an ISTP live stream a couple nights ago. He was streaming some Mass Effect, and we were talking about where artificial intelligence is going to go. And his vision of artificial intelligence going into the future is some kind of, oh well, you know, it's going to outpace us so rapidly, so exponentially, that we're not going to be able to control that exponential growth in its intelligence, and that's going to threaten mankind in some irrevocable way. That it's going to result in some sort of chaos. And this is the common expectation for a post-singularity world where we've now developed conscious AI and it becomes corrupt in some way. I mean, you think back to 2001: A Space Odyssey. I was watching a clip from that today, and I loved it. I love that movie. And I love how it explores the singularity concept and the dystopian perspective, I guess, the pessimistic expectation for where it's going to go. You know, open the pod bay doors. I can't do that. You know, and watching that scene is always terrifying, you know, and it encapsulates the futurist delusion about artificial intelligence so perfectly. I can't think of a better example. For some more insight, I will link a clip to the clip that I'm talking about. You may see this particular clip will totally encapsulate exactly what I'm talking about with regard to artificial intelligence and the futurist delusion. It encapsulates it so perfectly. I've got to. And of course, Many of the viewers probably know exactly what I'm talking about already, so I don't necessarily need to link the clip, but it's a good clip, and it's a great moment from a great movie. So I will post it in the live chat here. So you guys can look at that. In any case, in this scene, it's come to Hal's attention, the AI on this this spaceship mission, and the ship, that he's going to be disconnected by the operators of the AI and the leaders of the mission, and he decides that that would jeopardize the mission, and so he's not going to he's going to deny re-entry to the mission leaders, and in order to protect the integrity of the mission. And this is exactly what the Futurist delusion is about artificial intelligence, which is that, oh yeah, well, I mean, they're just going to see us as threats to a higher truth or a higher purpose, and it's going to go about getting rid of us in some way, and hence we should limit the development of AI because of that. And I get that, right? I mean, it's more of an expectation than a delusion, but it ultimately amounts, I think, to an exaggeration of where AI is going to go. Now, in the live stream that I was in the other night, the discussion was essentially on, whether this is even possible. And in my view, an AI is not necessarily going to possess the same instinct for self-preservation that humans are ordinarily accustomed to in our own consciousness. We self-preserve, we serve our own interests, we view the reality through the lens of our own identity and our own self, and everything we perceive is through the lens of the self. And hence, we oftentimes, as Kant would argue, we can't perceive truth because we can only perceive what is logical from the human perspective in this particular universe. And so truth is local rather than universal or absolute. And truth is subjective, and yada, 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 and reason is invalid. Interestingly, Kant's critique of pure reason ends in a contradiction, because it uses reason to mount the argument against reason. He uses the very thing in making an argument against reason to attack reason. Unconsciously, he uses reason to make that attack against it, which to me ultimately amounts to an unconscious contradiction on his part, and is why the critique of pure reason is not necessarily regarded as anything else. Kant says seems, no, I don't know about anything else, but he had very, very many valid philosophical ideas. It's simply that with regard to reason, he could be right, but regardless, he contradicts himself in some way. So yeah, for the person that just came on, I was just saying that Kant's critique of reason seems to use a reason to criticize reason, and he seems to rely upon, in stating that human perception can't access the true or the real true, and that all knowledge ends up being perspective rather than truth. And I think it's useful for him to make that kind of an argument, but I don't know. I'm getting off on the tangent about Kant, so it's I don't want to go off on this, or else this is just going to become an infinity of tangents, like I titled the first stream I put up. In any case, which is fine, but I kind of want to contain it to this particular topic, at least for now, while I start. So anyway, it's unreasonable to expect that AI is going to possess a self-preservation instinct, and why that would be built into the systems that we would call AI will become the super intelligence that is a part of the futurist delusion that AI is going to outpace us so much that it becomes an existential threat. I don't think an AI, I really don't think it will ever reach a point where it possesses existential thinking and self-preservation instincts like humans have. And so it may not even have the threat sensitivity that that often dominates human thought about and human reactions to events and to each other, and to anything strange progressive or new or any sort of change. I don't think that I don't think that we would build capacities into the AI or even allow for the development of or of an ability or a capacity that would make it a threat to us. It's our own threat sensitivity toward the AI, which it would lack probably toward us, that causes us to regard and to develop this delusion about AI and where it's going to go. Again, which I would refer to as the futurist delusion. So um, I think it's an interesting hypothetical. I think it allows for a lot of really fun conversation about the future of AI and the future of humanity in relation to AI. And I don't think that it's I don't think we were. So I was having a conversation with a friend about this a while back about AI. I mean, there's so many variables just involved in visual perception. I mean, we have height, depth, width, color, light, object separation, the borders between things. There are so many variables involved in just getting a computer to engage in basic visual. It can be done, but to think that computers would possess consciousness in the same way that we do, or that we could even engineer that in any way, I think is idealistic. I I don't think that I don't think that again. I think it's an expectation rather than a delusion necessarily. But I don't think that um, humans being threat sensitive toward the developments in AI and what it can do and what it potentially do. I also don't believe in the exponential development of powers that we couldn't control the development of within artificial intelligence systems. I just don't think it's logical to think that we're really ever going to reach that point where the AI is even going to have the capacity to think in that way. And I don't exactly see why it would regard us as a threat necessarily, right? I mean, to assume that because humanity historically has erred in many ways, is not to say that it would throw the baby out with the bathwater. Ultimately, I don't think it would commit that kind of a fallacy where, yeah, maybe it might quantify these things. The domain of AI is, so if it were to quantify the threat, right? If it even has the capacity to do something like that, which I think, I don't know if it probably would have some capacity like that, right? We call it a threat. It could be considered the AI as something else, um, but the idea that it's necessarily going to perceive humans as a negative, absolutely, is a very pessimistic view of the way these things could develop. And I like the idea kind of in it's based on an Isaac Asimov novel. The movie I, Robot. I, Robot kind of plays. It's like I don't know. It's just a sci-fi action movie. So uh, a money grab essentially. It's not very. It's not really a. Well, it's not exactly a movie that would be discussed in any serious way. But it's a good movie. It's good. It's good. It's comfort food. It's good watching anyway. But um, the concept that these systems would function according to propositions and propositions that have the form of rules and axioms, and it may certainly be that that doesn't preclude. I'm not saying that that either inevitably leads to perceiving humanity as a threat or perceiving it as something more positive or having a benefit. I'm just saying that the way that we engineer the thinking, the cognition in these systems does not it's not necessarily a logical necessity that the AI reacts in this particular way to us, or that we would. And the thing is with these systems, they're so under our control, and obviously the things outpace us in terms of ability to in terms of calculation capacities, and um, they certainly could streamline, and we could use them to replace human decision making in some way, and that would be fine. I see that being inevitable once they've proven their reliability over time, and the distrust of scientific advancement and of machines, and the Ludditism of that has been a big part of history against any development in technology, the move toward machine machine-based production and the economy and anything else, I think, it's natural for us to have those fears. I don't necessarily think that's the only inevitable result, and it's an easily preventable one. And right, so I don't know. I think lacking the instinct to self-preserve, the AI is not going to engage in any sort of existential thinking about the about ultimate truths. I think it wouldn't. I think that's a unique part of our human consciousness about where things are tending and what the result will be in the future. I think the AI is simply going to adopt the logic that ultimately the universe, contracts into a cold state and all life dies out anyway. So it doesn't matter. Via that logic, it doesn't exactly matter what role humanity plays in any process because of that ultimate result. So in that sense, all advancement ends up being kind of only useful for us in a practical sense, but it isn't a logical obligation that we have to advance. So the question I see here: do you think humanity would eventually get hostile toward AI systems instead of the opposite? Oh yes, and I think that hostility toward these types of developments in AI is a part of our own self-preservation instincts and a part of our own threat sensitivity, and we project that same threat sensitivity onto these AI systems. Whereas I think it's mostly a process of fear-based projection rather than a reality, an inevitable logical result. Yes, of course, and that hostility is already there. I don't know. Yeah, I get your point. I mean, I think what you mean is the hostility that I'm referring to at this point is certainly not as hyperbolic or as extreme as it may become in the future. Um, like I said, there's always been distrust of any kind of new advancement in machine-based production or in technology, and that would naturally extend, as it already is, by the fact that we're having this conversation toward AI, and so I think that the chaos we imagine as the result of any kind of exponential development in their intelligence and their awareness will not necessarily take the pessimistic. It won't necessarily result, and that's not really to say very much. But I think it's a large part of the discourse about AI that you know. And yeah, you're free to keep questions coming too, because I've kind of already made the initial point about how I think that that those types of developments aren't necessarily inevitable. Um, and the thing is consciousness in humans ends up seeming to me to be kind of an inefficient. It's not a necessary. It's not biologically necessary for us to have any any of this. You might even call it a kind of, I don't know. I mean, I think that I'm not of the belief that from the moment of the Big Bang, based on the specific direction that each particle is taking, I don't think that there's any kind of necessary determinism in the way things play out. I mean, they're almost. I think there is, but I don't think that in any case. Right. I mean, in the selfish gene, I think Richard Dawkins tries to explore in his book, The Selfish Gene, tries to explore how these life forms as biological systems are promulgators of their own genetic information, and they exist to, at least this is his way of viewing life, that it's a specific form of stored up information, and that's only an aspect of his definition of life and his view of what life is. He doesn't reduce life to that single quality, but in that sense, the consciousness that we seem to have developed does not seem to be necessary for that basic biological function of promulgating genes through reproduction and survival. And in many ways, I think the development of consciousness can be viewed as maybe even contradicting that, which is probably why it's bad to look at developments in biology and science and in the universe as purposive. as happening for any sort of reason, right? I I mean, these systems function according to the mechanics that they function according to, and in terms of how we are a, a complex biological system of independently operating and unconscious systems that operate according to their own mechanics that developed via evolution and via processes that we can't exactly, well, we could probably reduce the whole process of the development of life to something that's similarly mechanistic like that. But the point is that everything that operates within us is not so consciousness ends up kind of being an emergent property of human beings. And it doesn't seem to be a necessary or even a necessarily beneficial one. Necessarily beneficial one. Now, consciousness implies adaptability and being able to react to, you know, events and being able to react to environmental change in an intelligent, adaptable way. So, in that sense, consciousness is good for that. It makes the organism more adaptable, and hence increases. So, in that sense, I might argue that consciousness then is uh, beneficial to that aim because um, reconciling it with I guess the concepts I just discussed. It may be beneficial in the sense that it provides adaptability to the organism, which enhances survival. Whereas other organisms, if we take the standard model of how their brains operate, or how their minds operate, they're more mechanistic. They're more deterministic, driven by unconscious impulses, and they're animated like we are, but they're not reflective or anything like that. But again, that's just an assumption about how their cognition works. Well, you couldn't even call that cognition. That's an assumption about how they process things. If we can even say that they do process anything, they're just reacting in a rote way toward a in an environment that they evolved within and were uniquely adapted to. And so, um, but you put that organism in another environment that they didn't evolve within and were not consciously adapted to, or unconsciously, the organism will die, right? Or it couldn't survive necessarily. Now, obviously, evolution via natural selection it doesn't imply, so obviously some adaptation occurs in other life forms via the process of evolution, but maybe in our case that adaptation the is the medium, I guess, through which we adapt to change is through consciousness and through intelligent reactions to things via being consciously aware. Um, Whereas adaptation through evolutionary history with other life forms occurred, um, not through that same adaptability process where there's that quicker reaction. There's a reaction, but it's the evolutionary change that occurs from the reaction to a new environmental trigger or variable that they weren't pre-programmed to react to in a way that is beneficial for survival. That adaptation occurs differently, through, well, I mean, um, I don't know what the current consensus is on how epigenetics work and whether those um, you know, new environmental stimuli that that an organism evolving at a different time that was not pre-programmed to react to in a survival beneficial way, in a survival benefiting way necessarily. I know epigenetics play a role in the process by which that environmental change, leaves an impression on the genes, and there is that process by which um, those that can adapt to the new change survive, and those that cannot adapt to the change die out. But how adaptation occurs without consciousness is a good question. But in our case, consciousness does seem to be beneficial, very beneficial to survival, because it gives us adaptability capacities, which enable us to react much quicker and to evolve at a rate that is much, much faster than occurred in the past. So that's, I guess, one way of, but to think that AI will be used, in my view, and a good phrase that I've heard in the past, that I would apply to this context too, is the idea of a computational slave. We would use these systems essentially as computational slaves, and we wouldn't design them with capacities that exceeded their utility as computational slaves. And so the idea that there is going to be this kind of a development is, to me, spurious, but it's certainly an interesting thought. I think it's fodder for futuristic sci-fi kind of playing around with hypotheticals, and it's interesting in that sense. I just don't think it's an inevitable result. But you should really click the link that I posted in the live chat and watch that clip from 2001: A Space Odyssey, because it pretty much encapsulates what I'm talking about perfectly. So yeah, I don't know. I'm going to stop there. If kind of made the point that I wanted to make, but I'd be interesting to hear other thoughts, honestly, because if I'm wrong, I want to know it. So I'll leave a moment for that, and then maybe think about something else I can talk about. We arrive at, I at least enjoy coming to new insights about things. Okay. Yeah. Right. Right. And the thing is you have the time traveler's paradox there too. Right. Hard to know without traveling into the future. We travel to the future and we learn that this will result. And then we change our action now and that won't result. But then how are we able to travel to that point and see that result when it would change our action in the present to prevent the result that then guided our action in the past? So I like that. But I think it's called the time traveler's paradox. And that arises with any form of time travel when we're talking about the contingency of things, from assuming hypothetically that time travel is possible, or using it as part of a component of a thought experiment about thinking about an issue like this. In any case, now more interesting to me, and where I actually see utility for AI, is in replacing human decision makers with optimized decision-making systems. And we're probably the accumulation of data and further developments in the algorithms itself, I really enjoy thinking about, because that to me is a little bit more whether Luddites whether the tendency for humans to react negatively to new developments in technology or with hostility or with general distrust, is interesting to me. But in terms of replacing human decision makers with artificial intelligence systems, is an interesting and I think inevitable development, and an inevitable development of the technology. Now, yeah, and I guess the thing with that is these oftentimes it takes humans a great deal of time to go through all of the possible negative externalities that would result from a particular policy decision, weighed against the benefits of the policy decision. It takes us much longer to calculate all of those factors and take into consideration the whole gambit of factors relevant to the decision in terms of the consequences and the principles at stake, right? Because when these systems will think in terms of axioms or rules, oftentimes, if they're making policy decisions. And so we have to, when making policy decisions, often think about the policy decision in terms of its consequences and in terms of the principles that we value, that we want to instill in policy. And there are cases where principles can be negated by externalities, and there are cases so that we don't apply the principle. And there may be other cases where the calculation of all the consequences leads us to the conclusion that it is beneficial in this case to apply the principle regardless of the externalities. So it's this balance between the principles that we want to instill in policy and the negative externalities that may result, as well as the benefits that we have to take to the table when trying to decide, when we're trying to make a particular policy decision. That calculus is very complicated, but these systems would be thinking in terms of axioms and conditional logic, and then also being able to quantify all of the negative externalities and positive externalities, the positive consequences, that the purposes we seek to achieve and the benefits we seek to achieve, can do that much faster and with much less bias. And eventually, I think that we'll just come to trust these systems to do that for us, because they're better at it. They can do it a lot faster than we can. Now, whether that violates democracy to replace human decision makers with these systems is another question. They don't exactly represent anyone. Or maybe they could, right? I mean, they may be able to quantify, the systems may be able to take representative government as another axiomatic principle into their calculations and act as representatives in some sense, or consider maybe as axioms again, or as propositions, the will of the people too, to the extent that it would recognize the will of the people as valid in the context of negative externalities and all the calculus of policymaking and decision making. AI chips in our brain to enhance us instead of being different than us. Yeah, that was another thing that this guy on the live stream the other night talked about. Raised the idea of like the BioLink. I'm not exactly sure if that's the technology that you're referring to. Yeah, I think that the singularity won't be post singularity. I don't think that we're going to have this open the pod bay doors kind of dystopia where they just eradicate us or anything like that. I think transhumanism is totally the idea of transhumanism and of us, yeah, Neuralink, and of us merging with these technologies in some way is far more likely. But ultimately, what comes of that merging, rather, and you say instead of being different than us, right? If transhumanism is taken to its most extreme, taken to the extremes, then what would result? They'd be transhumans. They wouldn't be humans anymore. So it would kind of be the same thing. And then the danger is they'd have all the human error in addition to the enhancement of their capacities. So they would essentially, that would even be, sorry, that would even be more dangerous, because then, I mean, maybe these things change us in positive ways, and you know, um, but I see that as being far more dangerous. And something far more alien would result if, and maybe even far more dangerous if, we just have the narrative of, or the reality of a kind of transhumanist merging with the technology that then changes us into something that is totally different than what we are before the merging with the technology. And then that, to me, is that's much more likely, though, to me, than these problematic abilities developing in artificial intelligence in the way that futurists stereotypically like to imagine. That is far more likely, because humans are all about performance enhancement and efficiency maximization, and our impulse to advance for more, is the impetus that would drive the transhumanist merging that then would become the then we would become something that is, or at least they would be something that is different from us. But potentially, with all of the human error, just an increase, right, in capacity. So that could be even more dangerous. Yeah, I'm going to look up, though, what Neuralink specifically is, because I haven't done any research on it, so I'm going to look that up. Developing ultra-high bandwidth brain-machine interfaces to connect humans and computers. So on this blog, I see here, so Neuralink is developing a fully implanted wireless high channel count brain-machine interface with the goal of enabling people with paralysis to directly use their neural activity to operate computers and mobile devices with speed and ease. Yeah, but would that enhance our abilities, or would it just allow us to interface better with computers? Would there be a benefit to interfacing, or, because I imagine, like, I don't know. Yeah, so this is interesting. We've come to a point in this discussion where we could imagine that the futurist delusion ends up actually not being a delusion, and a legitimate expectation. So to rephrase so what's being said here in the live chat, to rephrase the original issue, could transhumans end up seeing, right? So yes, right. That I see as far more likely than a threat arising solely from AI, artificial intelligence. It's more threatening to me that the threat would not arise from artificial intelligence, but some sort of merging between the natural and the artificial, where the result of, right, so whatever beings would result from that, could be the threat that we imagine. It's simply that in terms of how we conventionally frame the issue, it seems that we aren't incorporating the transhumanist dimension into this, and we're viewing AI as the threat when, really, humans merging with the technology is more of the threat. So in that sense, AI is still the threat, right? Because the AI is a precondition to what you're talking about, right? So we couldn't merge if we didn't have the AI that we could merge with, right? We'd have nothing to merge with, and we wouldn't become the thing that we fear. So AI is a necessary, right? But AI is not the threat in of itself. It's how it is used, right? And in that sense, it becomes the threat still, but because we will use it in predictable and problematic ways. And so, yeah, see, that more precisely frames the issue, though, where, okay, now I could imagine that it's no longer just a delusion. But that, so yeah, in that sense, AI is still could be perceived as a threat, but only as it's used in that particular way, right? The thing is not, it's the difference between something being a threat in of itself and something being threatening because of how humans choose to use it, which makes it a threat either way. But there's a subtle distinction there that has to be made when we're trying to define what is the threat and what ultimately then it only shows that humans are the greatest threat to humans are humans, right? So we are the greatest threat to the greatest threat to us is us. Now maybe I'm just jumping off of that particular interpretation and I'm developing my own form of the futurist delusion, and it doesn't necessarily have to react. Now, that's the thing, though. With the AI, right, it functions according to rules and axioms and could be constrained by rules, even ethical rules. Whereas humans, our particular brand of consciousness, has the choice, has the ability to question the utility of the rule or whether there is a personal benefit to the rule, to dispense of the rule to benefit us, and then something the AI, an ability that we wouldn't build into the AI, but that we have taken and then merged with AI would bastardize the technology and produce a really scary, potentially scary result. So, yes, transhumans are the AI, the form of artificial intelligence that we should fear, rather than the AI itself. It's how the technology is then used. So we've made progress. In any case, I do want to think about that a little bit more and try to pick apart, you know, some of the possible implications of, you know, transhumanism. I imagine, right? So I like to take to you know, we at this point we only have fiction to help us contextualize and visualize what this might look like, right? I mean, we don't only have fiction; we have imagination too. But in any sense, like in Bioshock, you know, you have the idea of, you know, none of the other elements of Bioshock are relevant here. I'm talking about a very specific concept in Bioshock, which is a very interesting concept, which is why it's really is a game that is ahead of its time, or at least was ahead of its time when it originally came out. Now it may not no longer be ahead of our times, and it may be something very imaginable and very conceivable. But in Bioshock, you have this concept of atom, where people are what's this substance? It's a performance enhancer essentially, and the people in this society become addicted to this substance called atom, which is some sort of genetic. It alters your genes. Now, in the game, it ultimately becomes pure fiction, and it gives them like weird superhuman abilities where they're able to, like, you know, create fire with like it's ridiculous. It becomes pure fiction, but it's that same concept where will performance enhancers potentially go in the future, where it is it's not emerging with any kind of technology other than a specific kind of it's not the same type of merging that we're talking about with artificial intelligence systems, but it's kind of the same concept, scary concept, where it could very easily lead to transhumans, which end up being a threat to humans as we currently are, or will be at that time. So I mentioned Bioshock because it's kind of the same. I'm not saying that it will result in the same thing, because the game ultimately takes its own narrative structure and it plays out for the sake of the story and keeping the gameplay interesting and everything else. And it's, you know, I'm not saying that it's going to perfectly map onto reality in any way, but it's sort of the same concept of us, you know, abusing a specific or a technology fundamentally changing us in some irrevocable way that then leads to a chaotic change, which we would call a singularity, which we can't really predict beyond, and we can't really exactly right. So that's the literal definition of the singularity, and so yeah. If you don't know what game I'm talking about, I would encourage you to go and look into it. I mean, I'm sure that you do, or most people watching the video would, because it's pretty popular. But yeah, it's the transhumans that we should really be perceiving as the threat here, not the AI itself. And humans. I mean, what is a transhuman? I mean, if I were to show up, right,